Let's now get into the file key details. And here we'll provide a general discussion highlighting the background and key details for each file type that we submit in Fall 1. And we'll begin with the students enrollment or SENR file type. I should say here that there are training videos on the CSIS YouTube training channel, which cover each of these file types in depth, and the video for each individual file type is about 1 hour long. What we present today is a condensed version. So for clarification and further information, please do take a look at the extended discussions of each file type on the CSIS YouTube training channel. But let's go ahead and jump in with the students enrollment or SSID enrollment, the SENR file type. The SSID enrollment file is needed to first gain ownership of student records, which allows you to submit subsequent records for a student. The duration of LEA ownership of student records is from the enrollment start date to the enrollment exit date at your LEA in the student's SENR record. And again, this ownership is required to report any subsequent records in CALPADS, and ownership is established with the SENR record. The SENR record is also used to determine cohort inclusion for secondary enrollments for the adjusted cohort graduation rate, or ACGR, and cumulative enrollment in end of year 3. The SENR establishes a district of geographic residence, transfer reasons, and enrollment statuses, whether primary, secondary, short-term, or one of the less common enrollment statuses. SENR exits, and in particular exit reason codes, determine graduation, dropouts, and completers, and can be used to denote returning, transferring, and matriculating students. Some example exit reason codes include E155, year-end enrollment exit, expected enrollment at the same school next academic year. T160 indicates a transfer to another California public school. E230 is a completer exit, and so on. There are several codes in the CalPADS code sets document for values in the student exit reason code field of the SENR record. And SENR exits indicate post-secondary transition from middle to high school, graduation, and program completion. I have mentioned ownership a couple of times, so let's go ahead and take a slide to address it in detail here. So let's go ahead and answer the question, what is ownership? Ownership dictates who has the ability to maintain student data. Ownership of an SSID allows the LEA to submit and update records related to a student's profile during the enrollment period. The SENR start and end dates determine the period of ownership of student records in CalPADS. To add, update, or delete student information, LEAs must have ownership of the student record. If you get a GER5 error, that's a GERR0005 error, you do not have ownership of student records, meaning that the student isn't enrolled at your LEA during the period for which you're reporting data, and you should always check the SENR record start date and the SENR record end date to ensure that the data that you're reporting falls within dates that are between the SENR start and end date. If you get a GER5 error, the start date, end date, reporting LEA, and school of attendance are the 4 most relevant fields. So look for those 4 fields if you run into the GER5 ownership error. That concludes our discussion of the SENR file type. Let's go ahead and move on to discussing the SINF file type, or the student information file type now. And the SINF record is required for all students. In fact, when you submit an SENR record for the first time for a student, a shell SINF record is created in CalPADS, which you have to be sure to update. The SINF file contains demographic and address information about your student, and SINF files are used for the purposes listed on this slide. SINF records are used to indicate race and ethnicity, legal and preferred names, gender and gender changes, address history, direct certification matching at the state level. SINF records are used to identify students who are Title III eligible immigrants and are used to include students in the socioeconomically disadvantaged subgroups. So one more question for you guys. If you'll humor me, try to put some of your answers in chat here. Why are student information records important, and how are they used both inside and outside of CalPADS? I would love to hear from some of you folks if you can answer this question. I know it's actually 3 questions. Why are SINF records important? How are they used inside of CalPADS, and how are they used outside of CalPADS? But they are very closely tied together. So please feel free to answer any of those questions around the importance and use of SINF records in CalPADS. We did get one answer from Diane here with SSID matching. We got an answer from Alex with EBT, parent education level. All right. Thank you guys so much. And those are correct answers here. So within CalPADS, SINF records are used to identify students in certain subgroup categories, and that includes socioeconomically disadvantaged. The parent ed level goes into that calculation. So thank you for that answer there. Title III eligible immigrants and non-traditional gender. Non-traditional gender is a designation for participants and completers of CTE courses. Outside of CalPADS, the SINF records are used for state matching with direct certification and for accountability purposes by oversight agencies and the CDE. Diane, you are correct that the information contained in the SINF record, the demographic information about the student, is also used inside of CalPADS to locate potential matches for SSIDs. All right, so those are the uses and kind of the importance of the student information records. They do contain demographic and address information about your students. For the most part, it's a pretty straightforward submission. There aren't too many changes that occurred this year. In fact, I don't believe there are any changes that occurred to the SINF records this year. So let's go ahead and move on to discussing the student programs or SPRG file types here. In Fall 1, the SPRG file identifies students who are eligible for and or participating in specific California state or federal programs. Fall 1 eligibility program records are used again to identify eligibility for state or federal programs. Eligibility records are also used to report English learner instructional strategies, and this is done in LIP SPRG records. That's Language Instruction Program SPRG records. And LIP records use program codes of 300 to 307. And SPRG records, eligibility SPRG records can help to include students in socioeconomically disadvantaged subgroups. So this slide lists all of the program codes that are collected throughout the year. Some programs are collected in Fall 1 and others are collected in end of year. You're both able and encouraged to submit your program records on an ongoing basis throughout the year. And that's because it's important to report and update student eligibility and participation in CalPADS as soon as that information is available. Identifying eligibility and participation allows for students to receive additional services. And so that ongoing reporting really provides better services and outcomes for your students. And that's why we recommend the ongoing reporting of program records in CalPADS. However, if you do this ongoing program reporting, not all program records will show up on your Fall 1 reports. The orange tables on the left-hand side here contain the SPRG records that are formally collected in Fall 1 and will thus show up on your Fall 1 reports. So for example, FRPM records using codes 181 or 182, Gifted and Talented Education or GATE programs using code 127, homeless students with program code 191, tribal foster youth with program code 193 will all appear or are all expected to appear on your Fall 1 reports. And this is in addition to the language instruction program or LIP program codes, which are listed in the orange table in the center of the slide here. Other programs that students may be participating in will not show up until you see them in your end of year reports or your EOY reports, even if you submit that data now. And this includes the Title I Part A program, Armed Forces, Pregnant or Parenting, and so on. You may notice that homeless programs using code 191 appear in both Fall 1 and in end of year. And this means the information will be contained in reports in both data collections. So we did talk about the distinction between eligibility program records and participation program records. So how is the eligibility or participation identified? CalPADS will automatically designate SPRG records as either eligibility or participation records. Eligibility records indicate that the student has met the criteria to receive services for an educational program, but may or may not be receiving services related to the program. Participation indicates that the student is both eligible for a program and receiving the services associated with that program. The eligibility programs listed on the left-hand column of the table on the slide here include homeless, 504, armed forces, pregnant or parenting, Title I Part C, GATE, and tribal foster youth programs. The participation programs on the right-hand side of the table here include Title I Part A, the Opportunity Program, and the California Partnership Academy. In general, participation program data will show up on your end-of-year reports, but some of that data does make its way into Fall 1 reports, and that includes the Title I Part C program data. All right. As you're submitting files and student data to CalPADS, that information is used to identify students who are eligible for LCFF funding and will thus show up on reports 1.17 and 1.18. Report 1.17 is probably the most high profile report in Fall 1 in CalPADS, but there are kind of different criteria for inclusion on this report, as well as the supporting 1.18 report. Students will appear on these LCFF reports if they're reported as homeless, migrant ed, foster youth, and tribal foster youth in SPRG records that have a start date on or before Census Day. So, for example, Census Day this year is October 2nd. If a student is reported as homeless on October 3rd, they will not be included in report 1.17. If a student is reported as homeless on October 1st, they will be included in report 1.17. There are two programs that do not use Census Day as the cutoff. So two of these columns should be of particular interest for your analyses. NSLP, or the National School Lunch Program, and Direct Certification are the only two LCFF relevant programs that do not use Census Day as the cutoff point for inclusion in LCFF reports. The NSLP program, that's the third row of the table here. The NSLP program start date should be on or before October 31st. Applications that are received and date stamped on or before October 31st are included, regardless of whether the application was approved on or before this date. So the student needs to have submitted the application with a date stamp on or before October 31st to be included in the LCFF reports with their eligibility from the NSLP program. And then next is direct certification. This is the second program that does not use Census Day as a cutoff for inclusion in the LCFF reports. And with regards to direct certification, students must be certified between July 2nd and November 2nd of the current year. So those are the rules for inclusion in the LCFF reports based on the SPRG data that you submit. And in the majority of cases, students are included if they're reported on or before Census Day. Again, there are two exceptions to that with NSLP and direct certification, and we've just covered the rules for those. All right, that does conclude our discussion of the student programs or SPRG records. So let's go ahead and move right into student English language acquisition or SELA records. The SELA file identifies the student English language acquisition status for all students, not just for English learners. And this is in order to determine assessments, funding, and English learner services necessary. SELA records identify eligibility for the LPAC, English language acquisition status, whether TBD, English only, IFEP, EL, RFEP, or ADEL, along with the initial status date, and SELA records are used to include students in the socioeconomically disadvantaged subgroups for the LCFF. When performing work in the SELA record, you'll want to ensure that you have all of the information on this slide from your English Learner Services department for each of the SELA records that you submit. So that includes the English language acquisition status for every student or every record that you're submitting, the primary language, the status start date, and the correction reason code if applicable. And we recommend reaching out and letting your English Learner Services staff know what you'll need now if you haven't already. The correction reason codes are particularly noteworthy. There's a specific sequence to changes in English language acquisition statuses, as well as certain scenarios in which statuses can be changed out of sequence. If you're changing a status out of sequence, you'll need to use the appropriate correction reason code. And the correction reason codes can only be submitted in online maintenance. They're kind of used in a case-by-case basis, and so can only be submitted for a single student at a time in online maintenance. And the correction reason codes should be submitted with reference to the when to report a SELA correction reason code page of the CALPADS user manual. Kyron will likely take you to that page when he goes through the batch file demo later today, and I do have a screenshot of the relevant table from that page in a couple of slides here. So I'm gonna go ahead and hold off on visiting the user manual for the SELA correction reason code table. This slide contains the different ELA status codes that can be submitted for a student. And all students in grades TK through 12 must have an ELAS code reported in CALPADS. Students whose only language reported on the home language survey is English or American Sign Language are reported with an ELAS of EO or English only. Students with a primary language other than English or American Sign Language are reported as TBD until the LEA has completed the LPAC assessment process, the initial LPAC assessment process. The IFEP and EL statuses are the results of initial LPAC testing. If the student shows English proficiency on the LPAC, they will have an IFEP status. If the LPAC assessment indicates a lack of clearly defined English language skills, they will have an EL or English learner status. After some time, EL students may take the summative LPAC. If the summative LPAC results indicate that the student is English proficient, they will be reclassified as RFEP. The ADEL status in the upper right-hand side of the slide here is reserved for kindergarten through 12th grade students who are aged 22 or older, who are identified as foreign language speakers, but are not eligible to take the LPAC due to age restrictions. And it may be becoming clear here that there are progressions from certain ELAS codes to certain others. So let's go ahead and make that progression as clear as possible. And this chart shows the logical sequence of ELAS statuses or ELA statuses. The first step for an LEA to take regarding the ELAS is to distribute and collect the home language survey to student parents. If the home language survey indicates English or American Sign Language is the sole language spoken at home, the student will be given an ELAS of English only or EO. If the home language survey indicates a primary language other than English or American Sign Language, the student will be given an ELAS of TBD until they're given the initial LPAC assessment. Students may only remain in TBD status for 30 days. If a student is TBD and takes the initial LPAC assessment, the results will place them in one of two statuses. If the initial LPAC indicates the student is English proficient, they'll be placed in IFEP status. And if the initial LPAC indicates a lack of clearly defined English language skills, the student will be placed in EL or English learner status. And if a K through 12 student with an ELAS of EL becomes 22 years or older, they will be placed in ADEL status. If a student with an ELAS of EL is tested with the summative LPAC and the results of the summative LPAC indicate English proficiency, the student will be placed in RFEP status. The arrows on this slide show the logical progression of the different ELAS statuses. If a change is being made to a student's ELAS that is not represented by an arrow on this slide, it's not a logical sequence, and a correction reason code must be used. This is the valid uses of ELAS correction reason codes table, which you can also find in the CALPADS user manual, and it provides scenarios where correction reason codes are appropriate. Take a quick sip of coffee here before I keep going. Sorry, guys. All right, so correction reason code 1, that's in the first row of the table here, is evidence of non-English primary language, and it should only be used from transitions from EO to TBD. And if we look at the definition, that does make sense, right? EO means English only, and this status is given to folks whose home language survey says that English is the sole or primary language spoken at home. The correction reason code 1 is defined as evidence of non-English primary language. And if there's evidence of a non-English primary language, the student needs to be tested with the initial LPAC. So they'll be transitioned from EO to TBD. This is not a standard progression, but it can be made if we populate the correction reason code field with correction reason code 1. Correction reason code 4 is defined or named as ineligible student tested, and correction reason code 4 should only be used in transitions from either EL or IFEP to EO. So it shows up twice on this table here. It shows up in the second row and in the fourth row. In the second row, it transitions from EL to EO, and in the fourth row, it transitions from IFEP to EO. So those are the two types of transitions for which correction reason code 4 can be appropriate. And again, if we look at the definition as ineligible student tested, that makes sense, right? EL and IFEP are both the results of initial LPAC testing. And the EO status is the result of the home language survey, and EO students are not eligible to take the initial LPAC. And so if the student has taken the initial LPAC and has one of the statuses that indicate the results of that, but it turns out they were ineligible for LPAC testing, we would transition from that code to EO, and we would do so using correction reason code 4. The next one, correction reason code 5, is defined as evidence of EL or IFEP, and it again shows up in 2 rows on the table here, which show the 2 progressions for which you can use correction reason code 5, and they are from the status of EL to the status of IFEP, or from the status of IFEP to the status of EL. And again, if we look at the definition or the name of the code here, that makes sense, right? If they are EL and we have evidence of IFEP, then we would transition from EL to IFEP. And if they are IFEP and we have evidence of EL, we would transition from IFEP to EL. So those are the valid uses of correction reason codes in CALPADS. These correction reason codes are only applicable when the prior status date being corrected has a date on or after July 1st, 2018. So if you're correcting a code, or if you're correcting a status that is before July 1st, 2018, you cannot do so using a correction reason code. And these corrections must be done before a student takes the summative LPAC test. Remember, the summative LPAC test results in IFEP if the student is English proficient, and there are no instances of RFEP anywhere on the valid uses of ELAS correction reason codes table. So these codes must be used before the summative LPAC is proctored to a student. There are some new and updated language codes in CALPADS, which are relevant to the SELA file in Fall 1 this academic year. So let's go ahead and discuss some changes and some updates that are relevant to the SELA record. In order to LPAC test students who have a primary language that is sign language, but that is not American Sign Language, CALPADS needs to distinguish between American Sign Language and other sign languages. And in this effort, the ASE language code has been added to indicate American Sign Language. And the definition for the existing SGN language code has been modified to indicate any language other than American Sign Language, or any sign language other than American Sign Language. So in home language surveys, if parents respond with a primary language of ASL or American Sign Language, use code ASE. And for all other sign languages returned on the home language survey, use language code SGN. And this will ensure that students who speak a sign language other than ASL will be sent to TOMS for LPAC testing. All right, there is a further kind of update. It came in the form of a flash here that is relevant to the SELA file that we should discuss. So Flash 285 was released on August 8th this year with updated guidance on TK LPAC testing. The Flash states that the requirement to test students with the initial LPAC within 30 days of enrollment does not apply to TK students. LEAs should continue to submit the SELA file and populate the ELAS as TBD if the home language survey indicates a primary language other than English or American Sign Language. And the TBD status will remain with the student until they're tested with the initial LPAC when enrolled in KN. CALPADS is no longer sending TK enrollment records to TOMS, and TK students will not show up in TOMS as eligible for LPAC testing. A lot of LEAs have realized as they're kind of analyzing their own data in relation to this flash that they have inadvertently misenrolled a TK student in KN. That student was then sent up to TOMS before they were able to make the correction and place that student in the correct grade level of TK. If they're sent up to TOMS, simply changing their grade level in CALPADS will not revoke that. So flash number 286 was also released with guidance on what to do if you inadvertently misenrolled a TK student in KN and they made their way up to TOMS for testing. It does include guidance on 4 scenarios, and it is particularly helpful if you find yourself in that scenario or in that case where you've inadvertently misenrolled a TK student in KN. So please do look at Flash 285 and 286 for guidance on TK students and the initial LPAC. And that rounds out our discussion of the SELA file. Let's go ahead and move on to discuss the special education or students with disability submission in Fall 1. And the special education file types in Fall 1 include the meetings or meet file, which is used to capture the dates that specific types of statutory meetings were held. The meet file will be used to monitor the timeliness of statutory meetings, or the meet file is used to monitor the timeliness of statutory meetings. We also have the students with disability status, the SWDS, the SWIDS file type, and this is used to determine a student's eligibility for and participation in the special education program. It is called the status file, and the eligibility and participation variation represent the statuses. The plan file type is used to identify the specific plan and settings that a student is on at any given time. And the services or serve file type was formerly the SSRV file type. If you've been with CALPADS earlier than last academic year, the serve file type is used to report services for children and students who are ages 0 to 22, who are eligible and participating in the special education program and have active plans or will have active plans during the reporting year. So in this case, during the 24 to 25 school year. This slide contains a bit more details, a bit more information about the 4 different file types that we submit for special education students. The meetings file, that's the first file listed here on the left, is intended to capture the dates that specific types of statutory meetings were held. And these meetings include initial evaluations, annual plan reviews, eligibility reevaluations, and pending meetings. And the meet file is used to monitor the timeliness of these statutory meetings. The status file or the SWIDS file is intended to determine a student's eligibility for and participation in the special education program at any given time. And this is in line with IDEA reporting, with DataQuest, and with the California School Dashboard. The plan file type is intended to identify the specific plan and settings that a student is on at any given time. And this is again intended for IDEA reporting and allows for LEAs to submit plan changes with specific start and end dates independent of meetings. And this was a benefit and a change that came from the special education redesign. Previously, plan changes needed to be tied to a meeting date. Now, plan changes can have specific start and end dates that are independent of meetings. And the decoupling of plans and meetings, specifically with regards to dates, has involved kind of rethinking the relationship between special education plans and meetings. So this was an improvement, but it did come with some hiccups last academic year. Finally, the serve file type is intended to report services for children and students ages 0 to 22 who are eligible and participating in the special education program and have active plans or will have active plans this academic year. Again, these four special education file types are not submitted directly to CALPADS with either online maintenance or batch file upload. Rather, special education data is entered into the local special education data system, the local SEDS, and transferred directly to CALPADS from the SEDS via the application programming interface or API. The API is what allows for this automated interaction between the SEDS and CALPADS, which allows for faster processing of students with disabilities records. The local SED system will provide a report after each instance of the nightly process with information on rejected records. And guidance from both CSIS and the CDE is to make changes to special education data in the SED system rather than in CALPADS. And this is in order to mitigate against discrepancies between the two systems and the triggering of potential errors. There is a legal component to special education reporting and discrepancies between the SED system and CALPADS. So discrepancies between your local information and what's reported to the state could result in litigation. And for that reason, we recommend updating special education data in the SED system and not in CALPADS. There have also been some changes this academic year which affect special education reporting. So let's go ahead and talk about those changes now, beginning with some new special education non-participation reason type codes, as well as one retired special education non-participation reason type code. After discussions at the CDE in August of 2023, it was determined that changes were needed to make the distinction between revocation and cessation of services without revocation. Previously, code 24, withdrawal, was used in both instances. In the 24 to 25 academic year, code 24, withdrawal has been retired and replaced with these two new codes. Code 28 is named not eligible written revocation and is defined as: after a period of being eligible and participating in special education, the parent, guardian, or student, if 18 or older, has provided written revocation of consent for special education instruction and services. The student is no longer eligible for special education and services. And that last sentence is probably the most important in distinguishing between the two codes. If you use code 28, the student is no longer eligible for special education and services. Code 29 is named eligible cessation of services without revocation and is defined as, again, the parent, guardian, or student, if 18 or older, has voluntarily elected to cease special education instruction and services, but has not provided written revocation of consent for special education instruction and services. And this last sentence is, again, probably the most important in distinguishing between the two codes. The student is eligible, but is not participating at this time. So if we use a special education non-participation reason type code, we will have a status of not eligible in the students with disabilities status record. If we use code 29 for our special education non-participation reason code, we will have a status of eligible not participating in that status record. And so again, the last sentence provides the most help in distinguishing between the two codes. But the written revocation or lack thereof is an important explanation in the definition as well. So those are two new codes. Let's go ahead and talk about a couple of updated codes. So discussions with LEAs who use SACE as well as with the SACE vendor themselves indicated a need to modify special education non-participation reason type codes 11 and 12 to provide clarity and limit confusion between the two coded values. Both code 11 and 12 indicate eligibility with no education plan, and so they're often confused here. Code 11 is eligible, no education plan, and then in parentheses, parent declined FAPE or services. And the added context and clarification is evident from a look at the old and new definitions here. The highlighted sentence in code 11 adds the most weight in distinguishing between the two codes. Code 11 should be used when the parent or guardian has declined both the offer of FAPE and if parentally placed in a private school, a proportionate share of services that could be provided via an ISP. The majority of students are not parentally placed in a private school, and so in the majority of cases, Code 11 should be used if a parent has declined the offer of FAPE and has declined it wholesale. Code 12 is eligible, no education plan, and then in parentheses, we have other reasons. And the added context and clarification is also evident from a look or an analysis of the old and new definitions. Code 12 should be used when students are eligible with no education plan for any reasons other than a parent declining FAPE wholesale. The example provided in the definition here is the student will begin services on a later date, for example, the first date of school in a new academic year. Confusingly, this definition also includes the example of a parent consenting to initial provision of services, but not immediately to the offer of FAPE. This means that you should use code 12 if the parent didn't decline FAPE, but hasn't accepted it yet, causing no services to be provided. So those are the two updated special education non-participation reason type codes, in addition to the two new and one retired code on the previous slide. There is one more update to special education reporting to discuss this academic year, and that is a change to the user interface, a change to the special education containers that you see on the student details page in CALPADS. The SPED and SSRV containers in the user interface have been modified to archive read only, and the old SPED and SSRV ODS downloads have been disabled. This means that these containers will only show historical records and that the old special education reports are no longer viewable. And this is due to the special education redesign last academic year, which replaced these two file types with the four meet plan, SWIDs, and serve special education file types. All right, and that concludes my discussion of the special education submission in Fall 1.